What's going on, guys and gals? This is AutoTech, and today I'm going to show you how to remove and reinstall your front tire or front wheel on a Tiger 800 XCA. So there's a couple of different ways to secure the bike so that you can actually remove the front wheel. Unfortunately, my Vortex front stand doesn't even so much as really like flex the suspension on this thing. It barely worked on the Yamaha, so I really didn't have high hopes for it on this. And I'm not going to get into stacking like 3 pieces of 2x4 just in order to lift this thing. But the bike is equipped with a center stand. And if you're familiar with the center stand, you know when you throw it up, you can kind of teeter it back and forth like this and get the front tire off the ground. So what I did was I actually threw the bags on, and then I just put some weight in them so that it really wanted to lean to the back. And which is great. So, you know, I checked it after I put some weight in all 3 bags, and you know, it really didn't want to rock. But then I just kind of wedged a 2x6 in the engine frame or the engine guard, and now like it's really not going to come forward. Once the wheel is out, you've actually just removed another bunch of weight off the front of the bike, so it's going to want to lean back even more. So that's not the concern. It's when you're working with it. You know, if you accidentally pull down or you do something like that, you don't want the bike to come forward, and especially if you're sitting right here, you're going to have the bike coming and landing right in your lap, and that's going to be a really bad time. So basically, jumping right into it, you really only need a handful of basic tools. And you know, just a little bit of patience. You know, don't go ramming and jamming things, but we're gonna basically just get right to it. The ABS sensor, which is on the left side of the bike, is going to be a T30, and as you just saw, it really didn't take much torque to remove it. So with this, if you didn't watch my rear wheel video, there is a shim that just hit the ground. That shim is actually to space out this front sensor to give it the proper air gap. So make sure you don't lose this shim, and make sure you remember that it goes on the inside of the sensor. Now, I've found on this bike, the sensors aren't an interference fit. So they basically just fall out. In the event that yours is stuck for some reason, try to wiggle it and get it free. Don't pry on one side, because you just cock it and break it. So get that out of there, get it safe, and don't lose that stuff. Having a couple of zip ties within reach is good for this next spot. You can also use a coat hanger if you've got a bunch of them handy. What we're going to do is we're going to remove the caliper, which are 12 millimeters. And then we're going to go ahead and wind these bolts out. Once you get those bolts out, this is actually just going to kind of want to fall out as it looks. We're going to carefully unhook this from the front fender. Now that you've got the caliper away from the actual wheel assembly, it looks like just one zip tie is going to be good to secure this. So go ahead and get that zip tie on there, and you don't have to like cinch it down or anything. You just want it out of your way. The main thing is you don't want to bend the lines, and you don't want them to drop, because this outside rubber coating won't really show you any signs of damage. You'll notice it when you grab the brakes really hard, and then suddenly your brake line just kind of bubbles out like that because you broke the inside casing. So we're going to move on to the other side with a 12 mil again, remove that caliper, and then we'll check back in when we're securing it to the other side of the engine guard. So for this side with the double brake lines, once you get the caliper free, you're going to kind of want to just lightly pull out on the fender lip there, just to free it from that little brake line clip. And there you go, you're free from it now. So go ahead and get your zip tie in and secure this caliper out of the way. We're basically done with the hard part for the removal. Like, I'm not kidding. The rest of this is really just going to fall apart. Using a 6mm Allen, you're going to want to loosen these pinch bolts. Now you don't have to take them right out. I take them out before I put it back together. So like I get the tire up, get the axle through, then I take these out, put a hint of blue Loctite on them, then put them back in and torque them. But for removal purposes, you're basically just loosening them. And then you are going to grab a 17mm Allen head. You're probably going to have to buy this one because any kit that you typically get, they seem to stop at like 12 or even 10. So, you know, you're going to have to specifically get this one. But then it's good to have it, right? Because you can throw it in your tool bag when you go on a trip or something like that. So you're going to go ahead and loosen this. And this is where it's nice because you're going this way, so you're still pushing the bike towards the back, so you really don't have to worry too much about like pulling it forward. So that's good there. So now basically by hand, just kind of support the wheel a little bit so that if you know you get the rod too far out, it doesn't just drop the wheel down on that one side. And just by hand you can actually just kind of turn this out. It kind of threads into next week, so it's going to take you a minute. But there you go. So it's free. I ripped my glove. Cheap piece of junk. And now, using my toe just to kind of support it a little bit, I'm going to remove that. Ooh, no spacers hit the ground. Put that carefully onto something. Lower this and wheel the tire away. Perfect. So this spacer pops out. Nothing identifiable about it. And this spacer pops out. Nothing identifiable about it. And they look to be the exact same. Now, just because I'm picky, I'm going to separate them to the left and right side, but it looks like if you were just to throw them in a bag, you're not going to have any issues. I'm going to double check that in the instructions though. So I took a quick flip through the instructions, and they don't mention anything about those spacers being right and left. They just say install spacers, whereas the rear said install right side spacer. So you can go ahead, wheel this right out of there. And the best way to identify, because I was kind of thinking about this, I was like, oh, maybe I should put like an R and an L on the rotors. But then once I got to removing it, I realized the ABS sensor is on the left side. So if you're doing your own tire or taking it in or something like that, make sure to let them know that the left side is the ABS tone ring, and then they'll mount your tire properly. I'm going to take this to work and do it myself. This one, if it falls, it's going to land on the rotors. So make sure you store it properly. I'm actually just going to set it in the new tire because then the rotor will be protected. So we will check in with you guys later. If you're going to be leaving this for a bit, make sure you put your nuts and bolts and spacers and stuff like that in a baggie, just so that nothing gets kicked by accident, wind doesn't blow them away or something, you know, just good work practice. All right, welcome back there, guys and gals. Off camera, I took the liberty of cleaning up all the parts that are going to be going back on. And right now, I'm just smearing a little bit of brake caliper grease on those spacers. So go ahead and do that. And where did I put the lid for this? And then you're going to go ahead and take your rod, your shaft, and put some anti-seize on there. Now this definitely isn't something that you want to put a whole heck of a lot on, like just a little bit of a smear the whole way around it. And yeah, don't go crazy where it's going to be gooping all over it when you're putting it back in. All right, take your freshly mounted tire and rim and just kind of get it between the forks there. And then we are going to reinstall those spacers that we previously removed. And we're getting caught on everything. So yeah, go ahead, get these two popped in there. And now we're gonna kind of be ready to get it up there. So now, using your foot as kind of a lever point, go ahead and lift this up, making sure that those spacers stay in place. And then you can kind of hold it, and then go ahead and get your rod back in. You shouldn't have to force anything. If you find yourself having to like really jam it in there, I don't think you're where you want to be. And to help you turn it, to get it started, just use the socket in your hand. If you use a ratchet, you can cross that thread real quick, and that's going to be costly. But yeah, as you can see, this one just basically slid right up. So go ahead and turn this down as far as you can by hand, and then just use your ratchet and touch it down. So just while spinning the wheel, just kind of touch this down, get it snugged, and now we're going to torque that. But you definitely want to make sure that this turns freely and that it, you know, is looking pretty good. And now we're going to torque this. So being a dumb Euro bike, they use Newton meters, and it is 65 Newton meters, which appears to be 49 foot-pounds. So I'm going to hook my toe under this just to kind of keep the bike leaning back. I know it's well secured, but it's just better safe than sorry, because now you're pulling the bike towards you, which is the way that the stand, you know, kind of wants to fall off, right? So get it clicked, make sure everything moves good, and then double check that torque. So now that axle is torqued to where it needs to be. So don't worry about this pinch bolt just yet. We're gonna do that at the very end, kind of skip that step for now, because if you follow the instructions, they want you to get the bike off the stands right now, jounce the suspension, then tighten it up, then put the calipers on. We're just gonna put the calipers on, get it off, jounce it, then tighten that. So putting a little bit of blue on those brake caliper bracket bolts. Go ahead and cut your zip tie that you used for securing it, and make sure that your pads are spread. And then we're going to pop the brake line back in, which going in is a little bit easier than coming out. And for going on, just carefully take your time. See, it goes pretty quick. Make sure that that slides on, and then get your two bolts started. So for these 12mm brake caliper bolts, the torque is 22 Newton meters, which appears to be 180 inch-pounds. Yeah, go ahead and just make sure that these are torqued. If you remember when you took them out, they really weren't that tight, so you know, don't be farmer tightening them back down. So coming around to this side, the procedure is going to be fairly similar. Just go ahead, get that zip tie out of the way, being careful of your ABS sensor, and then carefully slip this on and go ahead and get those bolts started. Oh, we're going to torque these to that 22 Newton meters again, which is 180 inch-pounds. And now that you've got those all torqued down, let's go ahead and get this brake line back in there and this ABS wire back in there. So now, I know it's not an interference fit, but I always like to just put a little bit of brake caliper grease right around the very base of it, just so that, you know, there's really no chance of it ever sticking in that spindle there. So a little bit of blue on the bolt, and then don't forget about this shim. The shim goes on the inside to space out this sensor. So go ahead and get that bolt started and snugged down. So now the torque spec for that is 9 Newton meters, which looks like 85 inch-pounds. So it's pretty well the exact same as the rear. And using the T30, we are going to go ahead and torque that. Now, if all you're doing is removing it and reinstalling it, and you're not replacing any rotors, not any tone rings, anything like that, chances are your air gap is going to be just fine. But you know, if you're replacing any of those components, you're going to want to measure your air gap, which will be 0.1 of a millimeter up to 0.9 of a millimeter, and you'll want to get your feeler gauges down in there and make sure it doesn't, you know, it's within spec. If the air gap's too big, it's just not going to get the proper reading. If you're closer than 0.1 of a millimeter, chances are you're pretty well touching. So, you know, you'll know for sure right there. But for me, I feel if you're just removing it, reinstalling it, you're not going to change the actual depth of it, and you're not going to need a new shim. So now go ahead, take a moment, clean up your workspace, and get ready to put this thing back onto its own weight. So go ahead and take the stuff out of your bags, and then we're going to go ahead and get this off of the center stand. So now that you got the bike under its own weight, go ahead, grab that front brake, make sure it works, and then we're going to just jounce it a few times, nothing too serious, and then set her back over, and let's go to the pinch bolts. All right, so now before you go and just tighten these down, go ahead and take these bolts right out and put a little dab of blue on them, and then thread them all the way back in, but don't torque them down just yet. The torque for these is 22 Newton meters, which is 180 inch-pounds, so basically the same as the calipers. So if you had 2 torque wrenches, you could probably just torque the ABS sensor with the other one, and then just leave this one set right to that same torque. But yeah, go ahead, just give these a couple of double checks. These aren't actually like load bearing or anything like that. They're mainly just to keep the axle from sliding out. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. You have now removed and installed the front wheel on your Tiger 800 XCA. I would imagine the XRT and stuff like that will be very similar. Obviously you won't have the 21-inch front wheel, but I would imagine the setup is going to be very similar. Of course, always refer to your service instructions. Just use this kind of stuff as a visual guide. So if you've never done it before, you can be like, oh, okay, that slides through like that. Good to go. Even if you can't change over your own tires like I can, you can save a ton of money by doing this, because there's a lot of shops that offer like $25 loose tire changeovers. Some I've even seen like $19.99 plus shop fees, blah blah blah. So it probably works out to like 80 bucks. Just kidding. But you know, they charge you an hour to take off the front wheel and put it back on, plus the $25 to change it over. If you weren't playing around with a camera and taking pictures and stuff like that, I mean, you could literally get this thing off in about 10 minutes, and 15 minutes back on, you're done. So if you already have the center stand, I mean, you really don't have to spend any money on getting yourself a front lift, because you're going to need a pretty high front lift to get this bike off the ground. If you have any questions, or you know, you find yourself getting stuck, leave a comment down below, and I typically try to reply back as quick as I can. If you're new to this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's not going to be winter forever, so we will be back to riding this thing at some point. Thank you for taking the time and watching.